Well, in 1994, in Arrogant Capital, this is what you wrote. The political power of America's financial sector undercuts the prospect of reform. However, based on the behavior of wealthy investors in the late days of previous great economic powers, there is another reality. If finance can't be reined in, Washington will not be able to regain power over the economy on behalf of ordinary citizens. And that was in 1994.
I think that's basically correct. And one of the concomitants of the way the bailout has been conducted, or if I may, misconducted, has been that you're taking care to preserve, subsidize, coddle, stroke the same institutions that brainstormed a lot of the problems. It's just amazing to me. But of course, they've given a lot of money to Democrats, not just Republicans. Democrats actually got more money from the financial sector in 2008 than the Republicans did. So what I'm concerned about is, I think basically, I won't say they've bought both parties, but I think they have rented them for certain occasions.
Most recent, it's Bad Money, Reckless Finance, Failed Politics, and the Global Crisis of American Capitalism, published in May of this year. American Theocracy, the Peril and Politics of Radical Religion, Oil, and Borrowed Money in the 21st Century. Wealth and Democracy, A Political History of the American Rich. Boiling Point, Democrats, Republicans, and the Decline of Middle-Class Prosperity. We have American Dynasty. This is about the Bushes. Aristocracy, Fortune, and the Politics of Deceit in the House of Bush. Kevin Phillips writes, the 1950s were the last indisputably good decade for the American middle class.
Indisputably good in the sense that people had, first, the sense of a good war. World War II was a good war. It put us in charge globally. It got us out of the Depression. It moved America in a lot of ways that were very prosperous, and people had the sense of careers opening up and blue-collar jobs, moving them into the middle class. And the downside to that, and I realize there was a downside for blacks, although there again, they were probably doing better dollar-wise, but that wasn't the only yardstick. The United States was still on top of the heap globally in the 1950s. By the time you get to the 1960s, you had Vietnam. The angst of that decade was pretty high. You had the explosion in the cities, lots of things. So that's why I say 50s in the minds of a lot of people were the last decade where you really weren't very cross-pressured about what you thought was good about the United States.
Magnolia, Texas, thanks for holding. You're on with author Kevin Phillips.
How are y'all doing? I believe everything's got to do with the interest rates. That's what started the downfall. When Greenspan went to 1%, interest rates is what you use to run the market in the world. When you get too much capital out there and start greeding, you're supposed to raise the interest rates. Greenspan dropped them rates to 1%. I'm 62 years old. I never remember, never, that interest rates were ever that low. And them banks borrowed all that money, our money, at 1%, charged 6-7% on homes. They charged 15% on credit cards. And what it did, people like me and people that had money, we took our money out of the banks because we weren't getting no money, pay no interest on our money. And most of the people put their money in the stock market. But I know what the stock market and them guys do. I took my money and I bought, and you better listen, people, I bought 12 acres, John Deere tractor, I've got animals, I've got a lake with fish, I've got a creek, and I got my own water. I got guns. Buddy, we're bad now, but you know what's going to happen down the road. The dollar is going to fall like the... And all these people that think they got millions of dollars, their dollar's not going to be worth nothing.
Kevin Phillips.
Well, I guess I agree with about half of what the caller said. I think interest rates have been run over the last 25, 30 years for the financial sector. They're not aimed at regulating the real economy, although the real economy is the financial part, not the part that's out there that ordinary people work in. And the reason why interest rates are often pushed way down is not so much to stimulate the broader economy, but to increase the spread for the financial sector, for the banks, for the lenders of money, so that you can get money that you use in business at 1 or 2%. And credit cards were deregulated as far as fees in the 1990s and as far as maximum interest they could charge earlier than that. So the low interest rates mean, first, that a lot of retirees get less because their CDs don't pay as much, or they don't get an increase out of Social Security because it's a fairly weak economy, and the financial sector does really well. Now, the difficulty is that the financial sector has been built up and built up and built up for the last 25 years, so it's bloated with a capital B in a way that we've never seen before. They can't stand to have high interest rates at this point. You've got a whole debt structure of the United States. Total credit market debt when Greenspan came in 1987 was about $11 trillion. That's the portion of debt that has to go through markets as opposed to just being over the counter. Total credit market debt was about $11 trillion. By the time Greenspan left, it was about $44 trillion. You had a huge growth of debt in this country, and the financial sector has thrived on it. We now have a debt industry, a credit card industry, a mortgage industry, and they're all bigger than most other industries. And this has been part of what I call the financialization of the United States. And I have to admit, I think the Republicans are more to blame for this than the Democrats, but there are a lot of Democrats involved, and guess what? They're all coming back into office now with the Great Reform Administration.
Here's a quote from you. I'm a Nixon Republican, not a Bush Republican. What's the difference?
Well, first of all, I wrote a book called American Dynasty about the Bushes, because I really thought they were bad news. You go back and you remember George H.W., very pleasant man, but not exactly an overachiever. And for a while, he was trying to live down that Newsweek cover that called him the wimp. And when he left office about election time, he was down to like 35% job approval. I was the only president to lose more than 50 points of job approval during one term, until his son beat him. Son lost 70 points during his 8 years. Even bigger loser, in my opinion. But the whole notion that this country was putting itself in the hands of the Bushes, I mean, that's like in Egypt for a while they worshiped insects. And the whole notion that this could happen. So, yes, I considered myself a Nixon Republican, then I voted for Reagan twice. The one thing I never was a Bush Republican.
Next call for Kevin Phillips, Orlando, Florida.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to thank Mr. Phillips very much for his work and insight. Also, I'd like to ask him, what do you think the average citizen in this country can do to help take back the middle class incentive? And secondly, are there limits to growth in population? Thank you.
Well, there are limits to growth and there are limits to population, and I think we're probably heading towards a period where the real growth isn't going to be too much, because I think we're going to have so much debt and so much government that you won't see really a lot of growth, but there'll probably be inflation that disguises some of it. We're going to grow in population more than a lot of the older Western countries. In that sense, immigration is not a bad thing. In some ways, I think there's too much, because if you use the historical yardsticks, this country can't stand to have too much immigration over, say, 20 or 25 years before it needs time to sort of adjust to it. So I'm betwixt and between on some of that. But, as far as what we can do as a culture, I would say only this: follow everything they do as much as you can. If you think about whether you blame Republicans or Democrats, think about how you allocate the proportion, because neither one has been free of egregious errors, conflicts of interest, and entrenched interest group support. And we have a duopoly in this country. When you want to vote against what's in, the only way you can do this is to vote for what you voted against 8 years earlier, which is not a good thing necessarily. So the more people sitting out there can watch them, pay real attention wherever you can. Tell your relatives who don't pay attention, well, you don't pay attention and you think this guy is an idiot, you deserve the idiot. I mean, how did George W. Bush, whose job approval got down below 20%, doesn't it shame people in this country that the vote he got twice? And, you know, I wouldn't say that we shouldn't be shamed by the vote that Bill Clinton got. I think Bill Clinton was in some ways a national embarrassment. The man with a golden zipper, if he had anything that was really sincere and honest with his great brains, he'd have been a good president, but he was a phony. So it's partly the fault of the American people.
And in From American Dynasty, published in 2004, the Bushes have produced no college presidents or stonemasons, no scientists or plumbing contractors. Generally speaking, their progeny have become almost exclusively financial entrepreneurs. What's wrong with that?
Well, that's what they do. I mean, anybody who thinks that having a country made up of financial entrepreneurs, after we've watched the paper entrepreneurialism of the last couple of years, you shouldn't think it, because historically it's not a good thing. There are people who build small banks in rural areas that serve the county well and thoroughly for generations. There are people that just move money around, sit and think that life is theirs to do anything they want with. If they've got a credit card company, they want to pay 1.5% for their money, and they want to charge you 22%, and they want to charge a fee if you put the postage stamp on the wrong way. So the whole notion that these people are genuine entrepreneurs, most of them, is an absolute crock. The Bushes are classic examples, but I would need a whole program just to do a historical run-through of the financial adventures of 4 generations of Bushes.
And American Dynasty is the book, if you want to have that run-through on your own, published in 2004. Vancouver, Washington.
Mr. Phillips, I would just like to say that before we, well, I find it amusing, the caller from Texas, but before, you know, he's amusing, but at the same time, I feel the same fear and anxiety because I feel like I don't have a country anymore. These Wall Street gangsters have a pretty nice little racket set up. They turn up the speed on the squirrel cage so that all poor and working-class Americans inevitably have to neglect their civic life and not pay attention to politics and economics so much. And then that clears the way for what you've established on page 57 of Bad Money. Basically what we have is a modus operandi of the Wall Street ruling class and a complete continuity with the new administration. Hank Paulson, the current Treasury Secretary, of course, as you know, when he was head of Goldman Sachs, actually lobbied to increase the capital to leverage ratio so that they could leverage themselves 40-1. And this new Secretary of the Treasury, Tim Geithner, of course, was an understudy of Robert Rubin, who helped develop the CDO and structured finance. And it just goes on with Larry Summers and so forth. Also, Geithner was involved in the Mexican peso rescue, which you document so well in Bad Money. So I was wondering if you could comment on that a little.
And here is page 57 from Bad Money. U.S. financial mercantilism, bailouts, debt, and the socialization of credit risk, 1982 to 2007.
Well, I'd like to comment on it in ways that wouldn't get past the censor.
Or cable.
No, you're not. Not for this purpose. I mean, you can have problems, too. Let me put it this way. I don't know what actually anybody can do here, because we just had the election that's going to determine things for 4 years. Now, I voted for Obama. I half believe him. I don't totally believe him because I went to Harvard Law School, and what you learn in Harvard Law School was you say anything you want, but you work for the money. And basically, if you're in a big white shoe law firm in New York, you may talk like you're socially concerned, but you do your work on prospectuses for some financial flim-flam, or you work on a merger for amalgamated widgets, and that talks. So I'm really concerned that this was a shot where we really needed to have something happen. I don't write Obama off yet, but the continuity of all of this between taking people from the Clinton administration, when in their last 3 or 4 years, they were into just about as much overdrive on this garbage as the Bush people. And Bob Rubin was there and all of his little cast of characters. And now we have Paulson and we have Bernanke. And, you know, I wish I had some prescription. I don't have any prescription. I thought we were in enormous danger back in 2004, re-electing, and since it isn't a bad word, the nitwit. But he was opposed by Kerry. You know, I voted for Kerry, but I had to think about George W. the whole time, because if I'd just been voting for Kerry, I would have turned and walked out of the booth. So we've had 3 elections. 2000, that was a horrible choice. 2004, I made the choice, but it wasn't good. 2008, I had some hope. I don't have as much hope now. If this one doesn't work out, I really think the election coming up in 2012 there may be 1 out of 10 chances, whereas this time we had 3 out of 10, and then maybe in 2004 we had 5 out of 10. So if you want reassurances, turn to the networks, and they have some airhead on, you almost pick what you want, telling you reassuring nonsense that's certified by the power structure of both parties.
Next call, Las Vegas. Good afternoon.
Hi. Mr. Phillips, I'm a big fan of yours. I have many of your books. The Politics of Rich and Poor is a masterpiece, and I'm looking forward to reading Bad Money. As a fan, I'm worried that you might not make it through this whole 3 hours here. But,
I will.
At any rate, you know, George W. Bush seems to me to be utterly disconnected from reality. So I was wondering if you could comment on, is it merely willful ignorance or willful self-delusion, or is it something more serious? And could you also please comment on the cult surrounding Alan Greenspan, which seems to be at least fading away a little bit, thank goodness. So thanks a lot, and I really enjoy your work. Bye-bye.
One of the things about the Bushes is they're not terribly good at original thinking, but there's something in their biological inheritance that makes them good at memorizing things. And they have, for several generations, memorized baseball statistics. And at one point in time, when George Sr. was doing very poorly in his ratings, they had it in mind that he could memorize the faces and names of all the members of the press corps so that he could then butter them up, which is another one of his specialties. Nobody ever thought George H.W. was a heavy lifter strategically, and you know, he was Napoleon compared with his son. And you know, I don't know what you can say about him. He's personable in some ways. He'd make an excellent assistant vice president of a mid-range bank in rural Texas. But the whole idea that he's president of the United States and we have to go for it. I mean, he thought that he was picked by God to run. And then several times during his time in office, he made references to God wanted him to do this or that. He tried to turn the attack on the United States into pure good and pure evil and religify it, so to speak. Even his father got disgusted with him some of the time. I can't explain how we could have a George W. Bush.
American Dynasty is the book that Mr. Phillips is referring to, 2004. Woodridge, New Jersey, you're on with Kevin Phillips.
Hello. Thank you very much, Mr. Phillips, and I'm going to go out and buy your book, Bad Money. Just 2 brief comments. One is there was somebody who said in a democracy, people get the government they deserve. So I don't think in a democracy we could complain too much about what's going on. And the second point, I think what is lost in this whole discussion about what's going on in the United States is that we have had this crisis brewing because of the deregulation of Wall Street. On the other hand, during the same period of time, there has been something else going on, and that is criminalization of ghetto streets.
Criminalization of what?
Criminalization of ghetto streets.
Oh, ghetto street.
Ghettos.
Yes.
I'm sorry about my pronunciation, but ghettos. We don't consider really that there are ghettos in the United States. Of course, I understand that. But you understand what I'm talking about.
Well, absolutely. No. If it used to be in the English-speaking countries 200 or 300 years ago that you could be executed if you stole sixpence. At this point in time, you can be imprisoned for something that's total peanuts, but if you basically run a program called a bailout program, and you slant it so completely to Wall Street that it's a travesty. You even have a Republican congressman from California named Darrell Issa, who was on the Oversight Committee, who said that he thought Paulson's behavior made him criminally liable. But it doesn't, and I'm not saying he is criminal. I'm just saying that the double standard is enormous. The stuff that goes on that's done by people in power. There's a joke that if the United States wasn't the United States, the United Nations would have held hearings on invalidating our election. But we are the United States, so we can get away with stuff that assorted banana republics would have the UN jumping up and down and sounding off about it. So the double standard is enormous. It really is.
Recently on NPR, you said this about Treasury Secretary Paulson. Hank Paulson is a fellow who's got a sort of watermelon-sized understanding of what makes Wall Street tick, but a sense of politics that could fit in a mid-sized raisin. His approach to all of this, I think, has been extremely inefficient. He's been more concerned with bailing out Wall Street than solving the problem, because part of the solution to the problem had to be putting Wall Street through a ringer, and he wasn't up for that.
I'll repeat it here. I don't have the text in front of me, but anybody who listened to that carefully, not a word I don't still say. The only caveat would be I'm not certain that the understanding of the larger financial picture is watermelon size. I would say the understanding of the need of Wall Street was probably right up there with a watermelon size, but the ability to fit the needs of Wall Street together with the needs of getting the country back on its feet financially, maybe that's only a cherry, not maybe as small as a raisin, but certainly not very good. There's a growing sense among a lot of Republicans that what he's done and what Bernanke has done may be an incipient disaster.
One of the themes in many of your books, Mr. Phillips, is the decline of the manufacturing sector in the United States. And I want to tie that in, I'd like you to expand on that, but also Jim Ballmer of Durham, Maine emails in, I'd be curious to hear your opinions of the necessity of ensuring that Detroit's Big Three are able to continue as viable American businesses.
Well, I guess I favor some sort of support for Detroit, but I don't think it's likely to save them from major downsizing and to spread the problem a little bit, save some of the auto parts people and force them to gear up differently. We're not going to have that industry back in anything resembling the way we had it. Now, the notion that we're going to get manufacturing back in a major way, I find pretty dubious too. Back in the 1970s, you had, 25, 26, 27% of U.S. gross national product, as it was at the time, was manufacturing related. And finance was relative peanuts. It was down in the 10 to 12% range. By the early 1980s, you still had finance well behind, but it was beginning to catch up. By the 1990s, it was pretty close to catching up. And by 2004, right as the zenith of all the mortgage finance and then the housing bubble, you had the financial sector, which includes real estate finance, was up to 20.6% of GDP, and manufacturing was down to 12%. That is a disastrous imbalance. And it's an imbalance other countries that became leading world economic powers also saw intensify, not to the same extent that ours did. But what happens is when you've had global predominance for 40, 60, 80 years, certainly as the Spanish did, as the Dutch did, as I say, when New York was New Amsterdam, they were a major power, and as the British did, you develop a much greater reliance on financial services because you think you're the cat's meow. You've got all this global power. You can be in insurance. You can be in shipping. You can be a great advisor to the world, and you can make out based on finance. Well, always what happens is that your finance runs amok, turns speculative. You borrow too much. You have unstable financial sectors, and it implodes. And then the next country that comes up, guess what they do? They do real things. And I can't imagine that this country will be succeeded in the next 20 or 30 years by a new leading world economic power, be it India, China, or Brazil, that's run by a financial sector. Nobody gets that way until they have great power, late-stage sickness, which we've had. And we allowed these people basically to do stuff that historians will just laugh at, with all these gimmicks and the stuff they sold and the trash they assumed would be worth a AAA rating. You wouldn't want to hire these people in a lot of ways to empty your wastebasket, but you just hire them to empty you for 15 years. At this in a little bit of depth. We have enough time for it here. Essentially, with Britain and the United States, there was a continuum of financial relationship and successive leadership. But prior to the British taking over in the 17th century and a little bit of the early 18th, it's fair to say that the Dutch at that point in time were the leading financial and commercial power. And the Dutch had taken over, oddly enough, from Spain. And you wouldn't think Spain would have been in that league, but Spain in the 16th century included parts of Italy and Germany in the Low Countries where a lot of the banking took place. So you had really, Holland picked up its financial leadership in a kind of loose way from Flanders and Genoa and so forth, from the area near Holland, and became the great commercial and financial power. From that point in time, in the late 16th and early 17th century, you have a continuum, and it's a phrase that I think is very appropriate, between Dutch finance, British finance, and American finance. The British got the Bank of England and the stock market and a lot of ways of doing business, speculative finance, from the Dutch, who had the famous tulip bubble. If you go and you look at the histories like Kindleberger's Manias, Panics, and Crashes, a history of finance and financial excesses, you see that roughly 3/4 of the Manias, Panics, and Crashes he lists beginning in the early 1700s involved the British or Dutch or Americans as at least ingredients and major players in it. So we've had this speculative financial pattern that's guided this continuum, and which is now, I think, being globally discredited, that the failure of Wall Street, which is a colossal failure, and the British are just in it just as much, and the City of London is roughly as important as New York is in global finance, and they do the same sort of nonsense. More of it was pioneered in this country. All these wonderful things like credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations and all the other little alphabet soup things that some of it worked at earlier stages, but it's really Frankenstein stuff by the last 3 or 4 years. So I think we have basically pulled the plug on the global financial supremacy of the United States, and that the whole situation from here on in is going to move more in the direction of China. Now, just as China is the newbie, the country with a huge amount of central bank reserves and available money, the world's leading creditor nation, and we're the world's leading debtor nation, you're beginning to replicate the weaker elements of the British and American relationship in the 20s and 30s, when the United States was the ascending English-speaking power, and the British were the declining. And we were the creditor nation, and the British were the emerging debtor nation. They still weren't number one like we are now, the leading debtor nation, the house of cards par excellence. But they were in that role. And I think that what we're seeing is the beginning of a shift in global supremacy that will move to Asia. And it's not just China, it's also India, the Middle East, the recent National Intelligence Council Commission, whatever it is, report that came out. Very good. I find myself in substantial agreement with the intelligence agencies for about the first time in 25 years. They really see a big problem developing, and they understand that finance is an essential component, and that we'll be very lucky if the dollar is still the leading currency in another 10 or 12 years. I think it's going to be hurt pretty soon, maybe not until January or February, but maybe even before then, by the fact the American economy is being turned into a banana republic. Borrow it before you have it. Hand out money to every group you can imagine that's part of the power structure. And the extent to which the accounts of the Federal Reserve Board and the Financial Reserve Bank of New York and the Treasury and all the rest is just going so far in the red, it's going to look like nothing but a red wall. And the amount of money that's going to be poured out that's inflationary. And they understand. They say, oh, no, we'll get it back before it causes a problem. You know, I don't think these people didn't even know what the problem was when they started. They messed everything up. They said, oh, it doesn't matter. We're not going to bail out Lehman, but we're going to take care of AIG, and it doesn't matter. Well, it didn't look intelligent at the time. It doesn't look intelligent now. They've got something like $7 trillion in motion. This is going to it's going to make England look like a responsible creditor solvent nation compared with what we're doing. And when these chickens come home to roost, I don't believe for a minute that Ben Bernanke has a clue, practically speaking, about how he's going to solve this. He thinks everything is like the 1930s. That's what he did his academic thesis on. And it's one thing we don't need running the United States is people whose expertise comes out of a PhD thesis that's 30 years old, because this country is not what it was in the 1930s. In no way. Everything's totally different, and that he can assume that what might have worked in the 1930s, because a whole bunch of monetarist economists said, hey, this would have solved the 1930s. You know, it's like the French. They built something called the Maginot Line in the 1930s. That was going to present opposition, prevent the invasion of the Germans the same way they came through in World War I. Well, okay, they prevented World War I, which had already happened, but they didn't prevent World War II when they just came around and beat the French to death. And I think Bernanke is no more au courant with the moment than they were.